The wind howled through the dense forest, rattling the wooden walls of the secluded cabin. Snow piled high against the windows, nearly sealing the place shut. Inside, a man moved methodically, securing the last of the firewood near the stone fireplace. He had lived in this isolated corner of the wilderness for years, accustomed to the brutal winters that swallowed the landscape whole. But this storm was different. The weather reports had warned of an incoming blizzard, one of the worst in decades. A storm so fierce that even the most hardened wildlife would seek shelter. He had spent the past 2 days preparing, stacking firewood, filling water containers, and checking his food supply. Out here, survival wasn't just about comfort. It was about planning ahead, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a thick darkness settled over the landscape. The wind roared with a relentless fury, sending snow swirling through the air like a whiteout curtain. The man turned on his battery-powered lantern, casting a dim glow around the rustic interior. Outside, the storm intensified. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, their branches snapping with sharp cracks that echoed through the night. He sat in his worn-out chair, rubbing his hands together near the fire. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and he could feel the cold seeping in through the wooden walls. It was nights like these when the wilderness felt truly untamed, as if the world beyond the cabin had vanished into an abyss of snow and ice. Then came the first sound, a faint scratching against the outer wall. The man tensed, listening intently. It could have been anything, the wind blowing loose branches, snow shifting against the cabin, or even a small animal seeking refuge. He dismissed it, but then it came again, a long, slow drag against the wood, followed by a low, muffled thud. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He had lived alone long enough to know the usual sounds of the wilderness, and this was something different. He stood up, grabbing his flashlight. Through the frosted window, he could see nothing but swirling snow, the storm reducing visibility to almost nothing. Minutes passed. The wind continued to howl, but the sound outside had stopped. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just a trick of the storm. The mind had a way of playing games in isolation, turning the simplest noises into something more sinister. He stoked the fire, adding another log to keep the warmth from fading. The storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon, and all he could do was wait it out. He settled back into his chair, the rhythmic crackling of the fire lulling him into a false sense of security. Then suddenly a loud thump struck the door. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't falling snow. This was something, or someone, outside. The storm raged on, but the noise had changed. It wasn't just the sound of nature anymore. It was something desperate, something alive, and it was trying to get in. The wind shrieked through the frozen wilderness, shaking the cabin's wooden frame with unrelenting force. The fire inside crackled weakly, fighting against the cold that seeped through the walls. The man sat motionless, his pulse still hammering from the unexpected thump against his door. Then it came again, a slow, dragging scrape. His instincts told him to stay put, to wait it out. Whatever was outside, man or beast, was battling the same brutal storm. But this wasn't just the wind. The sound carried weight, a desperate, deliberate force against the cabin. Then came a growl. Low, weak, almost a whimper. His breath hitched. That was no human. Gripping the flashlight, he moved cautiously toward the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Heavy breaths rasped on the other side, uneven and labored. The air between them felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. He had spent years in the wilderness, learning to recognize the sounds of animals, their movements, their patterns. But this wasn't right. A bear wouldn't approach a cabin in the middle of a storm. They were masters of endurance, of waiting out the worst nature had to offer. Even in moments of hunger, they would scavenge rather than seek human contact. Why was this one here? Another scrape, another thump. His gut twisted, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He grabbed his hunting knife, not much against a full-grown bear, but better than nothing, and unlatched the heavy wooden door. A brutal gust of wind slammed into him as he pulled it open. Snowflakes, thick and blinding, spiraled into the cabin. His flashlight beam cut through the swirling white, illuminating a massive, towering figure just feet away. A bear, Not just any bear. This one was half frozen, its massive body covered in a layer of ice, fur stiff with frost. Snow clung to its matted coat, and its breathing came in heavy, agonized bursts. And behind it, huddled against the wind, were two tiny cubs. The man's breath caught in his throat. The mother bear swayed slightly, her powerful frame trembling from exhaustion. The cubs, small, fragile things, barely visible in the blizzard, pressed into her side, their fur wet and clumped from the cold. They weren't just shivering, they were shaking uncontrollably. She looked at him, not with the wild, predatory gaze of an animal seeking food, but with something else, something unnatural, something pleading. The man's grip on the door tightened. This didn't make sense. Bears didn't approach humans for help, especially not with their cubs, especially not in the middle of a storm like this. But this bear was different. She wasn't growling. She wasn't advancing. She wasn't trying to force her way in. She was begging. Her massive body sagged under its own weight, her front legs barely holding her up. Her deep brown eyes, almost hidden beneath the ice-covered fur, locked onto his. A chilling realization settled over him. She was dying. And the cubs. The man exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the freezing air. He had two choices: shut the door, leave them to the storm, and let nature take its course, or do something that defied every rule of survival. He looked down at the cubs again. Their tiny bodies barely moved, their paws tucked beneath them in a desperate attempt to keep warm. They wouldn't last much longer. Neither would she. The wind howled around them, a merciless force pushing against the fragile life standing on his doorstep. His grip tightened on the doorframe, every muscle in his body screaming at him to make a choice. And then, without thinking, without allowing himself to think, he stepped back and let them in. The moment he stepped back, the bear hesitated. Snow clung to her massive frame, her fur weighed down by ice. The cubs barely moved, their tiny bodies trembling in the harsh wind. The man's instincts screamed at him to close the door, to retreat into the warmth and safety of the cabin. But he didn't. Instead, he remained still, gripping the wooden frame, watching the bear with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the bear lowered her head. The man's breath hitched. It wasn't an act of submission. It wasn't a trick. It was something else entirely. A plea. A wild animal wouldn't behave like this. He had read stories, rare, almost mythical accounts, of animals recognizing human kindness, of wolves seeking help when injured, of deer approaching out of desperation, but never a bear. Never like this. The bear made no move to attack. She didn't lunge or snarl. Instead, she held her ground, her body swaying under the weight of exhaustion. And then she took a step forward. The man's pulse hammered. A bear inside his cabin. A full-grown bear, with two cubs. It was insanity. He gripped the handle of his hunting knife, his last line of defense. He had faced danger in the wilderness before. Stormy nights, encounters with wolves, even a close call with a cougar. But this was different. The mother bear's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, he understood. She wasn't looking for food. She wasn't looking for shelter. She was looking for help. The cubs pressed against her legs, so small, so fragile against the fury of the blizzard. One of them tried to lift its head, its tiny body shuddering violently. It was barely alive. The mother bear let out a low, strained whimper. Not a growl, not a warning, a sound filled with pain. The man exhaled sharply. His grip on the doorframe tightened. Everything inside him screamed against it, against the insanity of letting in a massive predator, against the risk, against the sheer impossibility of it all. And yet, he stepped aside. For a moment, the bear didn't move. She just stood there, the snow collecting around her paws. Then, with careful, deliberate steps, she entered. The heat from the fireplace hit her immediately, and her body tensed from the sudden warmth. Snow and ice melted off her thick fur, dripping onto the wooden floor. The cubs hesitated at the threshold, their tiny forms swaying. The mother bear turned her massive head toward them, giving a low huff, a signal. The cubs obeyed. Their tiny, half-frozen bodies stumbled forward, their paws slipping on the wooden floor as they crossed into the warmth of the cabin. The man forced himself to breathe. The moment felt unreal. He had just let a bear, a full-grown wild bear, into his home. But there was no turning back now. The mother bear took a few unsteady steps inside before her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed near the fire, her body trembling from the long battle against the cold. The cubs immediately pressed against her, curling into her fur. The man stood frozen, his back pressed against the door. His mind raced through the possible outcomes of what he had just done. She could attack at any moment. She could turn on him once she regained her strength. He had trapped himself with a wild animal. And yet, she made no move. She just lay there, breathing heavily, her sides rising and falling in slow, labored motions. The man swallowed hard. He had spent years out here, alone in the wilderness, believing he had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared him for this. Slowly, cautiously, he edged toward the fireplace, never taking his eyes off the bear. The cubs remained still, barely moving. One of them let out a tiny, pitiful whimper that made his chest tighten. He reached for the stack of blankets near the hearth, hesitating for only a moment before grabbing one and carefully laying it near the cubs. The mother bear didn't react. She didn't growl. She didn't move. She just lay there, her body exhausted, her breathing shallow. For the first time in his life, the man felt something he never thought possible. A wild animal had put its trust in him, and now its survival depended on him. The man stood frozen, staring at the unbelievable scene before him. A full-grown bear and her two cubs lay on his wooden floor, steam rising from their bodies as the ice melted off their thick fur. The crackling fire illuminated the exhaustion in their eyes, the sheer desperation that had driven them to this point. It didn't feel real. Nothing about this felt real. The mother bear barely moved. Her massive body rose and fell with each labored breath, her limbs stretched out as if she had finally surrendered to the overwhelming fatigue. The cubs pressed close to her side, their tiny bodies shivering, their fur still damp from the melting snow. They were too weak to even lift their heads. The man's survival instincts screamed at him to stay away. No matter how desperate the animals looked now, they were still wild. The moment the mother regained some strength, she could turn on him. One swipe of her massive claws and it would be over. And yet she had shown no aggression, no signs of hostility, not even a hint of defensiveness. She had walked into his home because she had no other choice. His pulse pounded as he backed toward the kitchen. His movements were slow, calculated, every motion deliberate to avoid startling the bear. He grabbed an old towel from the counter, his fingers gripping the worn fabric as he turned back toward the animals. The cubs trembled violently, their tiny forms barely able to stay upright. He knew what hypothermia looked like. If they didn't warm up soon, they wouldn't make it. Swallowing hard, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. The mother bear's ear twitched at the sound of his movement, but she didn't lift her head. Her massive body remained still, her strength depleted. The man knelt a few feet away, the heat from the fire warming his face as he carefully extended the towel. He hesitated for a moment before reaching out and gently draping it over the shivering cubs. They didn't resist. The tiny creatures barely reacted, their frail bodies sinking into the warmth of the fabric. The man exhaled slowly, his muscles stiff with tension. He had expected the mother bear to react, to lift her head, to growl, to do something to protect her offspring, but she remained motionless. For the first time, he noticed just how bad her condition was. Her fur was coated in ice, the thick layers still clinging to her back despite the warmth of the cabin. Her breathing was slow, too slow, and now that he was closer, he could see the deep wounds hidden beneath the frozen fur. Gashes, claw marks. She had been attacked. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Something out there, another bear, maybe wolves, had done this to her. She hadn't just been running from the cold. She had been running for her life, his hands clenched into fists. He had spent years living in the wilderness, respecting nature's laws, never interfering with what he wasn't meant to change. But this was different. He couldn't just watch her die here on his floor. Shaking off his hesitation, he moved to grab another blanket. His old emergency supplies were stashed in a wooden chest near the fireplace, things he hadn't touched in years. He pulled out a few clean rags and a small bottle of antiseptic, his heart hammering in his chest. This was madness, absolute madness. And yet he moved toward her anyway. The firelight flickered across the bear's still form as he knelt beside her. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched her fur. It was ice cold. Even with the warmth of the cabin, it would take time for her body to recover from the brutal cold she had endured. He could feel the ragged rise and fall of her breath beneath his fingertips. She was barely hanging on. His mind raced. He had never treated a wild animal before, let alone a bear. But he had seen enough injuries to know that if he didn't act now, she wouldn't survive the night. The cubs whimpered softly under the towel, their tiny bodies shifting slightly. They were still weak, but they had a chance. Their mother, not so much. The man clenched his jaw and made his decision. He reached for the antiseptic, unscrewing the cap with trembling fingers. The sharp scent filled the air as he poured a small amount onto a rag. He knew this was risky. One wrong move, one startled reaction, and he wouldn't live to regret it. His hand hovered over the first wound, the deep claw marks along the bear's side. This would hurt her. He braced himself, took a deep breath, and pressed the cloth against her wounds. For a second, nothing happened. Then the bear flinched. A low, rumbling groan escaped her throat. The man's pulse spiked, his entire body locked up, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. But it never came. The bear remained still. She let him. A long breath shuddered from his chest as he pulled the cloth away, now stained dark. She was bleeding, not enough to be fatal, but enough to prove that she was still fighting. Something about that fact settled deep within him. She hadn't given up, and neither would he. As the storm raged outside, the man continued his work, carefully tending to the wounds of the creature that had once been his greatest fear. Because tonight, fear no longer mattered. Tonight, survival was the only thing that did. The minutes stretched into hours as the storm raged outside, wind battering the cabin like a living force. Inside, the fire crackled, filling the space with flickering shadows and warmth, but the man barely noticed. His entire focus remained on the mother bear lying on his floor, her cubs curled tightly against her side. His hands trembled slightly as he worked. Every moment felt surreal. He was treating a wild bear, a massive predator that, under normal circumstances, would never allow a human this close. And yet, here she was, silent, still, trusting. She didn't move as he gently cleaned her wounds, the antiseptic stinging against her raw skin. She flinched now and then, letting out faint, rumbling groans, but never once did she lash out. The man wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or something deeper. Maybe the bear understood, on some instinctive level, that he was helping her. Maybe she was too weak to fight, or maybe, just maybe, she had chosen to trust him. His thoughts swirled as he dabbed another cloth against a deep gash along her side. That's when he saw it, something he hadn't noticed before. The wound wasn't fresh. It had been there for days, barely healing, now aggravated by the cold and ice. But that wasn't the shocking part. The claw marks. They weren't from another bear. His breath hitched. His first assumption had been a territorial fight. Bears sometimes attacked their own when food was scarce, when competition grew too fierce. But now that he was really looking at the wounds, a sick realization dawned on him. The gashes were too precise, too clean, too straight. They weren't from an animal. They were from a blade. His heart pounded. He ran his fingers along the edge of the wound, feeling the way the cut had sliced deep, too deep for an animal attack. Someone had done this to her. A pit of unease settled in his stomach. He had lived out here for years, long enough to know that most people avoided these parts. The wilderness was unforgiving, too far from civilization for casual travelers. If someone had injured this bear, it meant they were still out there, and they hadn't meant for her to survive. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Had she been hunted, left to die? But if she had been attacked by humans, why wasn't she dead? A wounded bear in the wild was as good as gone. Unless she had escaped. His eyes flicked to the cubs. Had she been protecting them? Had she fought off whoever had done this, barely surviving the encounter just to keep them safe? It was the only thing that made sense. A deep, rumbling sigh pulled him from his thoughts. The mother bear shifted slightly, her muscles twitching beneath her thick coat. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of just how close he was. Even weak, even injured, she was still a massive force of nature. He could feel the power within her, the sheer strength she possessed. But she didn't move against him. Instead, she let out a slow, heavy breath and pressed her head against the floor. A lump formed in his throat. She was giving up. Number, his fists clenched. He had seen this before, in animals too weak to keep fighting. They just stopped trying. When the body suffered enough, when the mind could no longer see a way forward, survival didn't matter anymore. He wasn't going to let that happen. Reaching for a towel, he pressed it gently against her wound, careful not to cause more pain than necessary. The cubs whimpered, sensing their mother's distress, and he felt something inside him tighten. They needed her to survive. Without her, they wouldn't last a day in the wild. His gaze drifted to their tiny forms. They were so small, so fragile. One of them, the smallest, wasn't moving as much as before. The other twitched slightly, its paws stretching out, but exhaustion weighed on both of them. They were starving. His stomach twisted. He hadn't even considered it before. But now that he was looking at them, really looking, he could see the signs. Sunken ribs, weak movements, the way their tiny bellies barely lifted with each breath. They hadn't eaten properly in days. Their mother had fought to keep them alive, to keep them warm, to bring them here. But now the fight was slipping from her. If she didn't eat soon, neither would they. The man pushed himself to his feet, his mind shifting into survival mode. He had food, nothing fresh but enough. He grabbed a small pot, filling it with water before placing it over the fire. He reached for the last of his stored meat, dried venison, tough but rich in protein. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to help. The scent filled the cabin as the meat softened in the hot water. The mother bear stirred slightly, her nostrils flaring. Good. She could still smell. That meant she wasn't too far gone. Carefully, he scooped a piece of the softened meat onto a plate and edged closer. His pulse pounded as he extended the plate toward her. She barely moved, her half-lidded eyes unfocused. But when the scent hit her, a small flicker of awareness returned. Her tongue flicked out, barely grazing the meat. The man held his breath. Come on. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then with slow, weak effort, she took the first bite. Relief flooded through him. She was still fighting. She was still trying. And as long as she did, he wasn't going to stop either. The cubs, sensing their mother's movement, stirred slightly. Their tiny noses twitched at the smell of food. And for the first time since they had entered his home, he saw a flicker of life in their tired eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The storm continued outside, howling through the night. But inside, in the warmth of the cabin, a man and a bear fought together for survival, and neither of them was giving up just yet. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the windows and pushing against the walls of the cabin with relentless force. Snow piled up against the door, sealing them inside as if the wilderness itself was testing their endurance. But inside, the real battle wasn't against the storm. It was against time. The mother bear had taken a few bites of the softened meat, but her movements remained slow, her strength still dangerously low. The cubs were barely reacting, their tiny bodies curled up against her side, their fur damp from melted ice. The man watched them carefully, heart pounding in his chest. He had done something impossible. He had let a wild bear and her cubs into his home. But what mattered now wasn't the shock of it. It was keeping them alive. He moved quickly, gathering every resource he had left. His food supplies were limited, but he had enough dried meat and water to last for a while. His emergency blankets were old but thick enough to provide warmth. He retrieved them from his storage chest, unfolding one carefully before draping it over the bear's massive form. The fabric barely covered her, but it was better than nothing. The cubs stirred slightly at the movement. One of them let out a faint whimper, its tiny paws twitching against the wooden floor. The sound sent a jolt of urgency through him. They were still too cold, too weak. Their small frames trembled even as they pressed against their mother's body for warmth. They needed more than just heat. They needed nourishment. He knelt beside them, assessing their condition. Their breathing was shallow, their bellies visibly sunken. They had been starving for days. The mother bear had given them everything she had left, but it hadn't been enough. Now, if she didn't regain her strength soon, they wouldn't either. His gaze flickered back to the mother bear. Her breathing was steady but weak, her body barely moving except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was fighting, but it wasn't enough. If he didn't get food into her soon, the cubs wouldn't survive the night. He needed to force her to eat. The idea sent a wave of hesitation through him. A bear, even one in this state, was still a dangerous predator. But the longer he waited, the slimmer their chances became. He grabbed another piece of softened venison, tearing it into smaller bits before kneeling near her head. The mother bear's eyes fluttered open, just barely. He moved slowly, cautiously, extending the food toward her nose. The scent of warm meat filled the cabin, and for a moment, she didn't react. Then a slow, tired movement. Her nostrils flared, her tongue flicking out slightly. "Come on, just one more bite." He shifted the food closer, waiting. After a long pause, she made a weak attempt to lift her head. Her jaws parted just enough to take the small offering, her tongue curling around the food as she swallowed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Encouraged, he prepared another small bite, pushing it toward her again. She hesitated less this time, her body still trembling, but responding. He watched, barely daring to breathe as she forced herself to chew, her massive form slowly accepting the nourishment it so desperately needed. The cubs, sensing movement, stirred slightly. Their tiny noses twitched at the scent of food, their eyes barely opening. They were watching their mother, waiting for her to lead them. The man's chest tightened. They needed her to survive. And somehow, some way, she seemed to understand that too. The next bite was easier, and the next. Slowly, painfully, the mother bear ate, her body still weak but no longer giving up. The flicker of life returning to her gaze was subtle, but it was there. It was working. He sighed, relief washing over him in waves. They had a chance. It wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't safe, but it was something. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind screaming through the frozen wilderness. But inside the cabin, for the first time since the night began, hope flickered like the fire in the hearth. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for theirs. The hours stretched on, the relentless storm outside hammering against the cabin walls as if determined to break through. But inside, something had shifted. The mother bear, though still weak, had eaten more than he expected. The slow return of strength in her movements was almost imperceptible, but it was there. She was fighting. She hadn't given up. The man sat on the floor a few feet away, watching carefully. Every instinct he had told him to remain cautious. Even injured, even desperate, a bear was still a bear. But the exhaustion in her eyes wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something almost recognizable. Trust. She had placed her life and the lives of her cubs in his hands. And that realization settled over him like a weight. The cubs, though still weak, had begun to move a little more, their tiny paws stretching against the wooden floor. Their fur was drying, and the smallest one, the one that had been nearly motionless before, let out a tiny, fragile squeak. It was the first real sound they had made since stepping into the cabin. The mother bear's ears twitched at the noise. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head toward them, nudging them gently with her nose. It was a mother's instinct, checking on her young. Even at the brink of collapse, her first concern had never been herself. It had been them. The man exhaled slowly, watching as the cubs responded, weakly nudging her back. Their movements were slow, hesitant, but they were alive. And right now, that was enough. He reached for another blanket and carefully unfolded it, his movements deliberate. He wasn't sure if the bear even registered what he was doing, but he draped it over the cubs anyway, tucking them in as best as he could. The mother bear didn't flinch. He sat back, rubbing his hands together, feeling the silence settle between them. It was strange the way the presence of a massive predator no longer felt suffocating. There was still fear, yes, the natural kind, the kind that came with the knowledge of what she was. But there was also understanding. They were here together, bound by the storm, by the circumstances that had pushed them to this impossible moment. He thought about how the night had begun, the sound of scratching on his door, the fear that had gripped him when he first saw her standing there, her body frozen and trembling. He had thought it was insanity to let her in, but now as he sat across from her, he wondered if it had been something else entirely. Fate, a ridiculous thought, and yet he couldn't shake it. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, warming the space just enough to keep the cold at bay. The storm howled beyond the walls, but inside, a fragile peace had settled. The mother bear shifted slightly, stretching one paw out in front of her. Her breathing was still slow, but steadier now. The cubs stirred beneath the blanket, their tiny bodies curling closer together. For the first time since they had arrived, he allowed himself to believe they might make it. He leaned back against the wall, exhaustion creeping into his own limbs. His cabin was no longer just his. It was a sanctuary now, a place where survival had transcended species. And as his eyes grew heavy, he realized that the storm, the fear, the impossible circumstances that had led to this moment, none of it mattered anymore. Because tonight, against all odds, a man and a bear had found something rare in the wilderness, a moment of trust. The first hint of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale glow across the cabin. The storm had finally begun to settle, its once violent howls fading into the distant whisper of wind against the trees. The man stirred, the weight of exhaustion pressing against him as he sat upright against the wooden wall. For a moment, he had forgotten that he wasn't alone, forgotten that the night had brought something extraordinary into his home. Then he saw them. The mother bear was still stretched out near the fire, her massive form unmoving. But something was different. Her breaths, once shallow and labored, were deeper now, steady. The ice that had clung to her fur was gone, melted away into the wooden floor. The wounds along her body, though still raw, no longer looked as fresh. The warmth of the cabin had done what the storm never allowed. It had given her a chance. And the cubs. He leaned forward, his pulse quickening. The smallest cub, the one that had seemed the weakest, was moving. Its tiny paws pressed against its mother's side, its body shifting as it stretched slightly beneath the blanket. The other cub lifted its head just enough to sniff the air, its ears twitching as if sensing the world around it for the first time in days. They were alive. Relief washed over him, a deep breath escaping his lips before he even realized he had been holding it. He hadn't been sure if they would make it through the night. He had done everything he could, but nature was cruel, indifferent, and yet, against all odds, they had survived. The mother bear stirred, his body tensed instinctively, but he didn't move. Not yet. He watched as her eyes fluttered open, the dark orbs hazy with exhaustion but clearer than before. She blinked slowly, as if registering where she was, what had happened. Then carefully, painfully, she shifted her weight and tried to push herself up. The effort was weak. Her limbs trembled as she attempted to rise, her body still struggling after days of starvation and exposure. But she was trying. She didn't collapse this time. She didn't sink back into the floor in defeat. She was fighting again. The cubs responded immediately, their tiny bodies pressing against her, their noses nudging her fur. It was a sight that made something tighten in the man's chest. They were waiting for her, depending on her, and she knew it. With a final push, the mother bear got her legs beneath her. She didn't stand fully, not yet, but she lifted herself just enough to prove she could. The firelight flickered across her fur, revealing the full extent of her injuries, but she no longer looked like an animal on the edge of death. She looked like a mother determined to keep going. The man sat motionless, his heart pounding. He had spent years alone in this wilderness, learning its rules, its dangers. He had seen the brutal way nature chose who lived and who didn't. But this was something else entirely. The mother bear turned her head toward him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, nothing else existed. There was no fear in her gaze, no threat, only understanding. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched as the impossible unfolded before him. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just an observer of the wild, he was a part of it. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows, illuminating the scene before him. The mother bear, once too weak to stand, now held herself upright, her body still battered, but no longer collapsing under its own weight. The cubs, sensing her strength, huddled close, their small forms pressing into her fur as if drawing reassurance from her warmth. The man remained still, watching. He knew this moment was coming. It had to. They couldn't stay. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. But the wilderness beyond the cabin was still theirs, not his. This cabin had been a refuge, a temporary sanctuary, but the bear and her cubs didn't belong here. And yet the thought of them leaving left an ache he hadn't expected. Slowly he got to his feet. The movement drew the mother bear's attention. Her dark eyes followed him, calm but alert. She had trusted him in the moment when she had no choice, but this was different. Now she had strength again, and with it came the call of the wild. He stepped toward the door, his boots crunching lightly against the wooden floor. This was it. He had done what he could, more than he ever thought possible. Now it was up to her. With one last glance at the cubs, still bundled beneath the blanket he had given them, he reached for the door and pulled it open. A gust of crisp morning air swept into the cabin, carrying the scent of fresh snow and damp earth. The sun hung low over the trees, casting long golden streaks across the untouched landscape. It was a world reborn after the storm, a world they belonged to. The mother bear hesitated. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, unmoving. She turned her massive head back toward him, her expression unreadable, but filled with something deeper than instinct. Gratitude. The thought sent an unexpected lump into his throat. Then with slow, deliberate steps, she moved toward the open door. The cubs hesitated at first, their small noses twitching as they took in the cold air. But when their mother let out a low, encouraging huff, they obeyed, stepping forward with cautious, wobbly movements. One by one, they crossed the threshold. The mother bear was the last to leave. She paused just outside the door, the snow crunching beneath her massive paws. For a brief moment, she turned back toward him, their eyes meeting one last time. No words were spoken, none were needed. Then with a final breath, she stepped forward, disappearing into the vast white wilderness. The man stood in the doorway, watching as their forms grew smaller, swallowed by the endless stretch of snow and trees. They were gone. A deep silence settled over the cabin. The fire still crackled inside, the warmth lingering, but the space felt different now. He had spent years alone in this place, comfortable in his solitude. But last night had changed something in him. He had witnessed something rare, something no one else would ever believe. He had given a second chance to a creature most would fear, and in return, he had been given something even greater. A moment of connection, a moment of trust, and as he stood there watching the tracks in the snow fade beneath the morning light, he realized something. He would never forget them, and they would never forget him. If this story moved you, imagine the countless other incredible tales waiting to be told. Don't miss out on more heartwarming and unbelievable stories. Subscribe to our YouTube channel now and be part of the journey. Hit the like button, share this with someone who loves wildlife, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us bring more amazing content to life.